Спасибо, меня слышно, да? Да. Тогда я начну. The legend of Melanippe, daughter of Aeolus and beloved of Poseidon, remains one of the least studied mythological strands of antiquity, due in part to its survival in comparatively few fragmentary accounts. For this reason, it is hardly surprising that the legend in question is consistently deprived of scholarly attention, with no detailed studies present in classical research. The majority of classical studies dedicated to the representation of women in antiquity, and in particular in the Euripidean corpus, wherein the cycle of two tragedies relating the fate of Melanippe is attested to, that is, Melanippe Sopher and Melanippe Desmotus, make no mention of the legend. The few scholars who do allude to the heroine in question either list the fragmentary sources relating to her legend without offering a connection between different versions of the myth, or observe that all extant accounts are irreconcilably contradictory and so cannot be studied as a unit. Therefore, the present paper will attempt to offer a new perspective on the mythological plotline of Melanippe by analysing the extant mythographic accounts of the legend, classical and medieval Byzantine, in the context of Greek and Latin dramatic fragments belonging to the lost Melanippe plays, that is, the two Euripidean plays and Ennius's Melanippe. The aim of the present paper is to demonstrate the presence of an inherent structural and narrative unity in the corpus of extant classical and medieval texts relating the fate of the tragic heroine. By determining, on the basis of mythographic accounts, the structural outline of the legend, alongside stable mythological elements such as toponyms and personal names. In modern classical scholarship, the extant mythographic corpus of the Melanippe legend is often dismissed as consisting of conflicting versions, lacking an internal cohesion. Mythographic accounts have been censured for offering little more than contradictions in detail, with Greek and Roman authors attracting severe scholarly criticism for providing patently fallacious synopses of the whole of the myth. It is, however, difficult to agree with such negative evaluations of the mythographic corpus of the legend of Melanippe, since, as we demonstrated in this paper, mythographic accounts offer the greatest insight not only into the existence, but also the preservation of the mythological plotline in question. Not only does the mythological corpus of the legend consist of a wide array of chronologically diverse sources, ranging from the 2nd century BC to the 12th AD, but also, more importantly, it preserves two detailed synopses of the legend in Byzantine mythographic sources, which contain reconstructions of the lost narrative of Euripides. I refer to Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Ars Rhetorica, which is dated to around the 2nd to 3rd century AD, and Gregory of Corinth, Rhetorus Graeci, dated to the 11th to 12th century AD. In order to analyse the extant mythographic accounts of the Melanippe legend in the most systematic fashion, it would perhaps be best to divide the mythographic corpus into two categories, which can be provisionally termed historical and Euripidean. Such a provisional division would make it possible to establish not only parallel sets of motifs, singled out on the basis of the first category, but also narrative structures, singled out on the basis of the second category, within the diverse variants of the mythological plotline in question. The first of these categories can be said to comprise three mythographic accounts by Diodorus Siculus, Hyginus, and Strabo, who preserve different versions of Melanippe's story, which share a number of significant details present in either all three, at least two of these so-called modest prose accounts of antiquity. Diodorus Siculus offers the fullest outline of legend by conflating elements from the Melanippe Sopher and the Melanippe Desmotus plays. As can be seen from the passage quoted on the slide, the narrative of Diodorus rests on three structural motifs. The first motif concerns the heroine. Arne is used as an alternative name for Melanippe, daughter of Aeolus, who bears the offspring of the sea god, Poseidon. This is all marked in red on the slide before you. The second motif relates to the heroine's father, who does not believe in the participation of Poseidon in her misfortune. This is marked green. The third motif concerns Melanippe, who is blamed for her dishonour and punished by exile to Metapontium. This is marked in blue. The fourth motif pertains to the heroine's children, who are said to be adopted by a childless stranger. This is marked purple. Although the structural elements present in Diodorus' account are not sufficient to constitute an autonomous plotline, they serve to indicate the general progression of narrative events in both parts of the legend. A series of identical structural motifs identified in Diodorus' narrative can be distinguished in Hyginus' text. As in Diodorus' account, Hyginus records three narrative markers. Firstly, the heroine, Roman historiography refers to her by an alternative version of her name, Melanippe rather than Anna, the daughter of Iolaus, bears offspring, two named sons. In Diodorus they are called Boethius and Iolaus. In Hyginus they are unnamed. To the sea god Poseidon in Diodorus and Neptune in Hyginus. This is marked in red on the slide before you. Secondly, Melanippe's father punishes her. In Diodorus he blames her and exiles her, giving her to a stranger. In Hyginus, the motif of her father's disbelief is not explicitly expressed, but implied by the motif of punishment. He blinds, starves, and casts her into prison. This is marked in blue on the slide. Thirdly, Melanippe's children are brought up by strangers. In Diodorus, the childless Metapontian adopts them. In Hyginus, they are taken in by cowherds. Again, this is marked in blue on the slide. Purple. It is possible to note that Diodorus and Hyginus share a set of structural motifs, on which the progression of the legendary narrative depends, making it hard to agree with scholars who think that Diodorus and Hyginus present conflicting versions of the legend. Strabo records an outline of the story analogous to the accounts of Diodorus and Hyginus, although his principal interest lies in the locus of Melanippe's exile, rather than in narrating the main events of her tragic fate. Strabo's account contains a set of structural motifs present in both Diodorus and Hyginus' texts. In all three accounts, Melanippe bears a male offspring. Strabo, like Diodorus, names him. This is marked in red on the slide before you. She is described by Strabo as a prisoner, highlighted in blue, and a detail one may compare with Hyginus' Fabula 186, where the heroine is thrown into prison. Melanippe is exiled from her homeland, marked in green, while the place of her exile is given as the city of Metapontium, marked in purple. Thus, as you can see from the slide before you, the account of Strabo, like the versions of Diodorus and Hyginus, rests on four consecutive structural motifs, which pertain to the narrative structure of the legend. Furthermore, Strabo preserves a quotation from Asius of Samos, an ancient Greek poet of the 6th century BC, which is regarded as the first known and only pre-Euripidean reference to Melanippe. You can see this quotation presented in the second table on the screen. Although Strabo deploys Asius' account as a supporting source, which corroborates the mythographer's own version of events, that is, that Melanippe was brought to Dios, not to Metabus, the reference to the heroine's son, who was named as Boethius, is indicative of the presence of a series of narrative elements upon which all three mythographic accounts rest. Thus, in contrast to the views of scholars who regard the mythographic versions of the legend of Melanippe as contradictory, it is possible to establish a causative set of stable structural motifs within them. Firstly, Melanippe is the daughter of Iolaus. This is traceable in Diodorus and Hyginus. She has an offspring, always at least one son. This is traceable in Diodorus, Hyginus, and Strabo. The father of the offspring is the same sea god, traceable in Diodorus and Hyginus. Melanippe is exiled. Both Diodorus and Strabo have this. She is given to a stranger to be taken to Metapontium. Again, see Diodorus and Strabo. And finally, the heroine is described as imprisoned. This is traceable in Strabo and in Hyginus. In addition to the presence of common structural elements, all three mythographic accounts share a number of narrative details, that is, proper names and toponyms. For example, Diodorus and Strabo record the same name of the child. Diodorus and Hyginus name the heroine's father Iolus, while Diodorus and Strabo mention Metapontium. The parallelism of both structural motifs and narrative details can be said to unite the mythographic accounts attributed to the first category into a single mythographic unit. However, although a cumulative study of extant mythographic accounts by Diodorus, Icolus, Hyginus, and Strabo reveals the presence of a series of common structural motifs and narrative details, the outline of the plot of the legend is not completely stable across all the three versions. This lack of consistency makes it impossible to establish a single narrative outline of the mythological plot shared by the extant historical mythographic accounts. The second category, distinguished in the mythographic corpus, termed Euripidean, offers a more consistent representation of the legend, since it comprises two versions summarizing the plotline of Euripides' lost tragedy. I refer to the medieval mythographer Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Ars Rhetorica 9, and the Byzantine mythographer Gregory of Corinth, Rhetorics Graeci. However, before turning to the analysis of the Euripidean accounts of the legend, it is necessary to remind ourselves of the relics of the Melanippe legend preserved in the Greek dramatic, the Latin dramatic, and the visual traditions. As is commonly known, Euripides' Melanippe plays survives in only a few sparse fragments, preserved by later Greek, Roman, and medieval authors. The first and most famous play of the Melanippe cycle, that is Melanippe Sopha, the Wise, survives in a series of fragments, of which the vast majority are believed to contain lines spoken by the heroine herself. Fragments 480 and 481, preserved by Lucian and Plutarch, Moralia 390, respectively, contain what are believed to be the opening words of the play spoken by the heroine. They shed light on the style of the play's prologue and the tragedian's depiction of Melanippe's character, but offer little aid in the quest to discover the plotline and narrative progression of the play itself. Fragment 487, preserved in Aristophanes' Desmophoria Zeusai, and fragment 482, recorded in Aristophanes' Lysistrata, offer an insight into Melanippe's self-assessment and her ability to express her religious and philosophical tenets, but again shed no light on the structure of the tragedy's narrative. Finally, the remaining fragments, 483, 484, and 485, which contain excerpts from Melanippe's reses, her speech in defense of her sons, can likewise be used only to shed light on aspects of the presentation of the tragedy's eponymous heroine, her rhetorical finesse, her courage, and her wisdom, rather than on the narrative outline of the tragedy. The Latin dramatic tradition of the legend, which preserves Ennius's fragmentary tragedy Melanippe, composed in the late 3rd and early 2nd century BC, is believed to have been modelled on Euripides' Melanippe Sopha. Likewise, cannot be drawn heavily upon to establish the schema of the myth, since only 4 fragments of the Roman tragedy survive. Indeed, of these 4 fragments, which are preserved by the Roman grammarian Nonius and the Roman philosopher Macrobius in the Saturnalia, 2 are as yet unattributed, with scholars uncertain as to who the speaker of these lines could be. Fragment 106, which contains a natural description of the earth and sky, could belong to Melanippe's speech, in which she summarizes Anaxagoras' cosmogony, while the other fragment, 103, could be taken to refer to the heroine's twins. The remaining 2 fragments can be used only to provide an original insight into the representation of a single character of the tragedy, Melanippe's grandfather Helen, who is not attested to in the fragments of Euripides' Melanippe Sopha. The classical iconographic tradition likewise offers only a very limited insight into the schematic plotline of the Euripidean tragedies, since the most notable visual artifact which preserves the legend of Melanippe, an Apulian volute crater dated to 330 to 320 BC, depicts only a single scene of the action, the judgment of Melanippus' twins. The scene depicted on the crater can be employed to gain an insight into the relationship between the three central characters of the lost tragedy: Helen, his son Iolaus, and his granddaughter Melanippe, rather than into the development of the play's action. As can be seen from the images on the slide before you, in the lower zone of the vase, the cowherd, who first discovered Melanippus' twin sons, hands them over to the white-haired Helen. On the left margin of the composition, Iolaus stands in profile, gazing on at the central panel, while mirroring him on the right-hand side, Melanippe and her nurse huddled together in great fear. Despite his age, which is signified by white hair and decrepitude, stooping figure and stick in his right hand, Helen, rather than Iolaus, the ruling king of the land, occupies centre stage. Whereas the old man's figure is dynamic, he appears to be making a stride forward, with one of his feet brought before the other and his arms outstretched towards the cradle in which the twins lie, Iolaus stands passively with his arms folded. Even his garments are plainer than those of his father. His robe and boots are intricately adorned with white and black details. The representation of Helen as an active figure who decides the fate of the twins in a visual tradition can be contrasted with a mythographic hypertext. As will be shown later on in the paper, the account of Dionysius of Halicarnassus suggests that Iolaus, the father of Melanippe, rather than Helen, her grandfather, makes the judgment. However, this conflict in traditions can be accounted for by the nature of mythographic accounts, which seek to summarize the main sequence of events in a mythological narrative with varying degrees of accuracy, depending on the author's personal concern. However, despite the intricacy and the beauty of this iconographic detail, and its invaluable insight into the relationship between Iolaus, the king of Thessaly, and his father, the seer Helen, the Apollon-volute crater cannot likewise be drawn upon to establish the narrative progression of the legend of Melanippe. Therefore, in view of the fragmentary nature of Euripides' tragedies, the sparse visual tradition, and the narrative inconsistency of the historical mythographic accounts, an attempt must be made to determine the outline of the mythological plotline of Melanippe on the basis of mythographic accounts of the legend, termed in this paper Euripidean. That is, as I have said before, the accounts of Dionysius, of Halicarnassus, and Gregory of Corinth. As can be seen from the table, which offers a parallel representation of the two medieval summative accounts, both mythographers aim at summarizing the Euripidean variant of the legend, although Gregory of Corinth presents a more detailed account than the condensed version of Dionysius of Halicarnassus. The latter offers a crystallized rendition, reduced to the semantically most important elements of the narrative, which are sufficient to outline Euripides' version of the legend. Both mythographic accounts rest on a parallel sequence of events which are circled in the table. These can be said to constitute the pivotal narrative elements of the plotline. Firstly, both mythographers concur that the legend commenced with Melanippus' rape by Poseidon and her conception, marked in red on the table. Gregory of Corinth affirms that Poseidon caused Melanippe to expect twins, while Dionysius, despite recording a more violent sequence of events, claims that Melanippe was raped by Poseidon and bore two babies. Note the alternative use of verbs by the two mythographers to denote the same event. Gregory of Corinth has epoesan, which means to make or cause, while Dionysius has eparanthe, derived from peraino, meaning to complete one's purpose or force oneself on someone else. This lexical variation points to a slight shift in the representation of Melanippus and Poseidon's relationship, from mutual favour to violence. Secondly, both mythographers agree that the heroine disposes of her children in a bovine environment, marked in green on the table. Gregory of Corinth offers a more detailed sequence of events, suggesting that the heroine asked her nurse to leave the twins in the cow stall, and adding that her actions were caused by fear of her father. Dionysius offers a more abridged version, simply stating that the boys were placed among the cows of Melanippus' father. Despite the minute variation, unlike Gregory of Corinth, Dionysius makes the heroine responsible for placing the boys in a cow stall, both mythographers describe exactly the same action, abandoning the boys in a place with cows. They even deploy proximate synonyms to denote the cowshed, with Gregory of Corinth using the word boustasin and Dionysius bouphorbia. Thirdly, both mythographers make a male relative responsible for the decision to destroy the infants, believing them to be monstrous. This is marked in blue on the table. Gregory of Corinth suggests, as in the visual tradition, that Helen influenced his son's verdict to burn the twins, persuading him to the violent action, whereas Dionysius concentrates the agency on Iolaus alone, making him reach the decision to harm the infants by himself. Despite this minor variation in detail between the two sources, that is, the addition of an extra character Helen, both mythographers agree on the same sequence of events. The father of Melanippe attempts to destroy his own grandsons. Finally, both mythographers conclude their accounts by pointing to the existence of a speech delivered by Melanippe after the decision is reached to destroy her sons. This is marked in purple on the table. Gregory of Corinth simply records that the heroine made an intercession on behalf of her sons, while Dionysius supplements an additional detail, qualifying the nature of the heroine's speech. He states that Melanippe attempted to demonstrate that her sons are no monsters. Furthermore, both mythographers concur that the heroine's speech is delivered in defense of her sons. Dionysius deploys the participle boethousa, derived from boetheo, which means I help or I aid, while Gregory of Corinth deploys a periphrastic constructions, which can be literally construed as she put forth a speech as an intercession, recreating the extensive length to which the heroine went in order to preserve her sons. Thus, it can be suggested that the structural outline of the mythological plotline consisted of 4 elements, each of which was responsible for the establishment of a narrative layer in the mythological plotline, commencing with the cause of Melanippe's tragedy, her rape and conception, and concluding with the revelation of her dread secret in her speech in defense of her sons. These elements can be found in a number of other extant versions of the legend, including historical mythographic accounts and Greek, Latin, and dramatic fragments analysed earlier on in the paper. Thus, the paper has shown that the vital missing key to the understanding of the mythological plotline in question, branded groundlessly by modern scholars as inconsistent and incomplete, can at last be found in medieval Byzantine and mythographic accounts. These accounts can, in effect, be said to have ensured the preservation of the legend of Melanippe of Thessaly, the daughter of Iolaus and the lover of Poseidon, ensuring its survival up until the present day. Thank you.
Большое спасибо за доклад, очень интересный, и за такое, вот я бы сказала, усиление античной тематики в нашей средневековой секции. Как мы вот видели, по-моему, ни один доклад не обошелся без античности, но, конечно, вот в последнем докладе античная тема прозвучала наиболее ярко, и мне кажется, что это очень удачно в качестве завершения вот нашего сегодняшнего заседания гаспаровских чтений и соответствует очень интересам Михаила Леоновича. Мы помним, все-таки для него античность была его главным интересом, а Средневековье так вот несколько производным. Вот, я вот спрашиваю опять, задаю свой традиционный вопрос, есть ли вопросы, но вот тоже в качестве такого комментария могу сказать, что лично мне этот миф был совершенно неизвестен. О Меланиппе я никогда не слыхала в своей жизни, вот, о том, что ее звали то Арна, то Меланиппа, тоже не знала. И вот тоже как-то поражаюсь действительно трудностям, которые стоят перед специалистами вот в области классической филологии, которые должны работать с какими-то вот фрагментами, но которые уцелели, так как-то вот совершенно просто даже отчасти и не уцелели, отражаются вот в средневековой мифографии, и благодаря средневековой мифографии все-таки вот так вот дошли до наших дней, хотя, к сожалению, вот, видимо, не очень хорошо дошли, потому что, вот я повторяю, я имени вообще Меланиппы и мифа о Меланиппе никогда даже и не знала, и не узнала бы, вот если бы действительно не вот эти вот средневековые мифографы. Я не знаю, вообще занимался кто-то, вообще как это они реконструируют, просто совершенно невозможно представить. Кто-то занимался вообще вот из специалистов по классике вот этим мифом, или он совершенно так вот похоронен за недостатком свидетельств?
Очень интересный вопрос, потому что легенда Меланиппы, к сожалению, относится к числу тех античных сюжетов, которые почти забыты современными исследователями. И ее имя вообще почти не упоминается в монографиях, посвященных Еврипиду или Эннию, или даже греческим женщинам. И если кто-то вообще-то упоминает Меланиппу, то только в числе других трагических героинь, которые там как-то связаны с ее циклом. И ученые в основном используют ее мифологический сюжет как пример общих культурных феноменов. То есть, например, обесчещенная дева, или мудрая женщина, или любовница Бога, или непокорная дочь. Как бы такая эмблема такого вот очень узнаваемого феномена. Но что очень интересно, что современное отношение к Меланиппе очень отличается от древнего, потому что в античности Меланиппа очень была на слуху, как вот героиня. И даже Плутарх обращает наше внимание на ее храбрость и на ее дерзость, и цитирует строчку, первая строчка из Еврипидовской трагедии, говоря, что она не очень приличная, и, по мнению древних, вообще вот, ну, даже была, может быть, несколько богохульна. И я уже цитировала эту строчку, когда у меня был слайд про Еврипида, но я еще раз ее просто вот повторю, даже, может быть, переведу на русский. Она, там написано, что Зевс, кем бы он ни был, ибо я знаю о нем только по словам других. То есть, иными словами, Меланиппа признается, сообщает всем своим зрителям, что Зевс ей известен только как мифологический герой, как он известен нам, как мифологический характер. А она в него, кажется, и не верит. И Плутарх сообщает, что эта строчка настолько потрясла и даже оскорбила древних зрителей, что Еврипиду пришлось ее переписать, иначе отказывались ставить его трагедию. И вот ему пришлось переписать на гораздо менее яркую строчку, я тоже цитировала, я сейчас уже не помню, какая она была. Но вот очень интересный действительно вопрос вы задали, потому что очень отличается современный и древний подход к героине. Простите за такой длинный ответ.
Это очень интересно. Я даже не думала, что... Может быть, какие-то еще есть вопросы? Может быть, у нас...
I'm not a specialist in Byzantine, of course, but as far as I understand, so this is, the topic was Byzantine mythography. You see, I have always thought that when ancient Greek myths were adopted, so to speak, into the medieval mind, they were always interpreted in a Christian sense. So are there any elements of or attempts of Christian interpretation of this myth or not?
Thank you again. That's a very interesting question. I think that there actually probably aren't with this myth because there are very few elements that can be construed in a Christian sense, because obviously Melaniepa is almost, I hate to use the very anachronistic term, atheistic heroine, but in fact she is, because as I've just mentioned with this opening line, she says, Zeus, whoever he may be, so she almost rejects the existence of gods, and if she rejects the existence of ancient gods, she almost denies the existence of a divine power above humans. She's also very interested in philosophy, and particularly Anaxagoras' philosophy, and she kind of outlines this hypothesis that there is mind, as in a sort of governing force which rearranges matter. So basically Anaxagoras' doctrine. So I suppose that could be construed in a quasi-Christian light, but I haven't seen any constructions either in Byzantine mythography or by modern scholars. But thank you again.
Thank you very much. Yes, perhaps this belongs more to a philosophical interpretation, yes, because, ancient Greek philosophers also rejected gods to a certain extent, some of them. Thank you very much.
какая-то философская интерпретация. Sorry, is there any philosophical sort of streak or interpretation in these myths? Because you mentioned Anaxagoras. Does she refer to him, or how is she connected with Anaxagoras?
And that's a very interesting question. She doesn't refer to Anaxagoras by name, and indeed she doesn't refer to Greek philosophers by name or by sort of group. But what she does in one of the surviving fragments is she outlines a striking notion of the cosmogony, which is very like Anaxagoras' cosmogony in a number of details. So as I mentioned, she talks about this overarching force which doesn't have a conscience, doesn't have a body, but it has a sort of mind which is has the power to arrange and rearrange matter. Then she also mentions seeds, which is another concept of Anaxagoras, and obviously the seeds are the little particles of all things, which are then originally exist in a kind of primeval conglomeration, and then they're separated and rearranged by this mind, by Nous. She has that in one of the surviving fragments, and some scholars have actually expressed the idea that she may have gone on to expound Anaxagoras' theory in much more detail, because obviously her restless in defense of her sons is, as recorded by ancient mythographers, fairly extensive, but obviously that unfortunately is lost. So we can only conjecture into how much detail she actually goes into, but there are definite markers of Anaxagoras' philosophical tenets in her speech.
Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Меня очень поразила вот эта вот фраза «Я женщина, но у меня есть ум». Вот это какой-то такой ключ вообще какой-то мировой культуре. Вот хотя я женщина, но ум у меня есть. Это тоже какой-то такой приятный мотив на сегодняшней конференции. Все-таки вот, ну, не вполне же уж мы действительно безмозглые и только достойны действительно проживания в кухонных каких-то этих самых пределах.
Вот. Современно, просто в тренде.
Да, абсолютно. Просто...
Василию Великому принадлежит высказывание «женщина – друг человека».
Да, поразительно, что просто вот действительно в античности и потом в Средневековье этот мотив оказался, ну, как-то вот зафиксированным. Это как-то оказалось очень важным. Вот, большое спасибо еще раз всем. Если нет больше вопросов и желаний высказаться, а может быть, есть такое желание у кого-то? Может быть, у Веры Аркадьевны есть такое желание?
Я просто в восхищении онемела.
Вот, так вот, я тогда хочу сказать, что очень удачно мы завершаем, по-моему, наше сегодняшнее заседание, и огромное спасибо всем докладчикам, спасибо тем, кто принимал участие в дискуссии, и несмотря на вот все-таки очень сложные какие-то вот такие обстоятельства, в которые мы все поставлены сейчас, мне кажется, что из того, что вот мы могли сделать, мы, может быть, даже как-то вот достигли чего-то, ну, приближающегося к наилучшему. И вот хочу пожелать доброго здоровья всем, вот просто обратиться ко всем с призывом как-то себя беречь и, ну, вот как-то сохранять действительно вот свое здоровье для того, чтобы, в частности, и радоваться жизни, и заниматься дальше вот теми счастливыми материями, которыми мы занимаемся. Большое спасибо еще раз, вот, и до встречи теперь в субботу, да, вот, Вера Аркадьевна.
Дорогие коллеги, третья часть наших гаспарских чтений действительно состоится в субботу.